We preach this all the time to metro chambers of commerce, to regional chambers, to come together and talk more about government advocacy. A lot of their mission statements are something like the voice of business, but a lot of them don't put their money where their mouths are. You guys are different, and thank you so much for doing that. We've been around the state this year congratulating members of Congress who have voted the right way. From our perspective, and Adam Kinzinger is certainly one of those, and we've done a similar event up in Rockford and some other places. So when Dave mentioned that this might be a possibility and we would try to help put it together, we wanted to jump at the chance. I think it's technically not in the district, although I do remember being here when the congressman used to represent the district, so a remap. Folks in Springfield and their infinite wisdom saw fit to move him out a little bit, but the congressman really is a champion of business. He's won our spirit of enterprise this every session he's been in Congress. Like I said, he has a 94% lifetime record with the U.S. Chamber, a stalwart champion that we continue to send back. And I could read off the list of the votes from last year. But I won't bore you with that. A lot of those items have been taken care of, and I think the congressman will talk about some of those. It's been a big week this week in Washington, and I think he'll probably talk about that. I did want to introduce or give the microphone over to Ben just for a brief moment. He's not going to steal too much of the congressman's thunder, but we did get finally passed a large 5-year surface transportation, highways, bridges, rail. It really means a lot to Illinois, and the reason that Ben is here, he used to work on the Hill as a staffer on the transportation side. Has been advocating on transportation through the Illinois Chamber, the coalition that they lead, that the local chambers are on as well, called TFIC. I'll let him explain that just briefly and what the transportation bill means to Illinois.
Thank you, Ben. And as he said, for the first time in 7, 8, 9 years, there's a long-term surface transportation authorization that has been passed by both the House and the Senate as of last night. The President's expected to sign that today. What that means is there are 5 years of certainty, 5 years of planning that can happen. And not just for companies that build the infrastructure, but for those of us that rely on it. And a lot of that comes back to the efforts by the Illinois Chamber, working with a lot of our local chambers across the state. And I know Ben had asked you all to give yourselves a round of applause. Really the effort, the grassroots effort, the education, the outreach, and the support from businesses, from people like you, to Congressman Kinzinger and others in the delegation really ensured that Illinois was not a state that people were worried about. But as a result of that, we can continue to grow our logistics and transportation fields. We can continue to be the center of the nation's transportation infrastructure, which is a big deal, which drives a lot of our economic progress here. But with that, the Transportation for Illinois Coalition did sit down with the congressman in Morris back in, I think it was August recess, and he reaffirmed his commitment to passing a long-term surface transportation authorization. And now we just need some folks down in Springfield to take a page out of the congressional book, something I thought I would never say this year, and sit around the table and come up with a bipartisan, bicameral deal, which is what came out of the U.S. House of Representatives. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Ben.
Great. I was going to mention two more things that were in this transportation bill very briefly. One is a permit streamlining piece that was our top regulatory reform agenda, was passed in the Senate and House bill, and will be signed into law by the President, we suspect, which really puts a shot clock, because there's basketball fans here, a shot clock on these so-called NEPA reviews, environmental reviews, to help speed some of these infrastructure projects that have been really languishing, since 2008 or so. So that was a big win. And then the last thing I'll mention is the Export-Import Bank. And really, I think the term leadership is thrown around a lot. So-and-so is a leader on this. The congressman was a leader. There's a really good article in Washington Post which quotes his today, which you can find, which quotes his chief of staff and a little bit of behind-the-scenes wrangling on this. Certainly, the U.S. Chamber, the Illinois Chamber. Many of the state or the regional and metro chambers, including the Southland Chamber, had been advocates for EXIM, Export-Import Bank renewal. And this is probably an obscure-ish federal agency that no one has heard of until a couple years ago, when some of the folks on the hard right were saying, it smells like government. It's a 4-letter word, even though it returns money to the Treasury, and it helps largely small businesses find export partners around the world. But Congressman Kinzinger was a leader in getting the Export-Import Bank reauthorized. If it weren't for his leadership and that of a couple radical moderates in the House that really spearheaded, and I'll let maybe him explain the process if he wants to, but it's called a discharge petition. It's only happened once in the history of Congress, essentially, successfully before, to get it loose and through a committee that was led by someone who didn't like the bank. We wouldn't have an Export-Import Bank, or we wouldn't be on the verge of having an Export-Import Bank reopened. Thank you again for that. Thank you for all your support and all of your votes that you've taken last year. Again, a 94% record with the U.S. Chamber. So with that, Adam Kinzinger, please join us in accepting your Spirit of Enterprise Award.
Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. I know if you ever go to his Washington, D.C. office, you'll probably see these displayed. It means a lot, I think, to our members of Congress when they get recognized for a good job. So thank you, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go out and see him, too. Gives a good tour.
Dave, do you want to introduce? Or?
I think, go ahead, Ben. We'll get to it, the program. But
Sure.
they all have his bio on the table.
Short and sweet. It's name, rank, and serial number. But with that, Adam Kinzinger, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Appreciate it.
thanks, guys.
Yeah. I gotta tell you guys, it is good to be here. And at the beginning of any speech, you usually say it's good to be here, and most of the time you don't really mean it. But no, most of the time, you know what I gotta tell y'all, honestly, it is really great to be here. When I found out that I was gonna be at this dinner with you all, and by the way, at CD and Me, which the last time I was here was the big election night that some of you, I know many of you were at in 2010. A little insight on that. I don't know if you guys know, that election night, I actually had the flu. And I had to power through, and went to bed at like 2 in the morning and woke up at 5 a.m. It was the worst time I've ever had in terms of having the flu. But it was the best night in the world. We had 1,000 people out here, and just the energy was exciting and outstanding. And then 4 months later, I learned that I'm going to lose this part of the district, and it was sad. All of you, a lot of you had done a lot of hard work to get me where I am today. And let me just tell you, I don't forget that. And I appreciate that, and I hold that close to me. It's not always being in Congress and dealing with congressmen and congresswomen. It's not always about who you can vote for, but it's about who can vote for you. So even though many of you don't live in my district, in fact, probably most of you don't live in my district's very close. And what matters to me is the fact that I can go to Washington, D.C., and vote for the values that you guys represent, that you guys know is right for the future of our country. And just, a lot of the times when you hear from politicians, I don't have really any speech prepared. I just want to kind of talk a little bit and kind of give you an update of what's going on, and then we'll open the floor for questions. But, typically when you hear politicians come up and, you're watching the presidential race and some of those things, it's really easy for a member of Congress to stand up and to tell you everything that's wrong with your country. To stand up and tell you, where Washington, D.C. is screwed up and where Springfield is screwed up. By the way, I will say a joke on Springfield. The only good thing about Springfield right now is it makes us look highly functional. But, it's always this kind of doom and gloom, right? And we always just focus on the negative because, frankly, it works for politicians, because I can stand in front of you and I can say everything's terrible and I'm the only guy that's going to fix this. But, there are a lot of challenges, and we're going to touch on them. But look, there's a lot of good stuff going on in this country. I mean, look at the energy revolution that's going on in the United States of America. Look at the fact that Saudi Arabia has had to increase its oil output at $40 a barrel only to keep U.S. producers from usurping them as the leader in the world market. Look at the fact that the Russians, who are tearing apart Ukraine and trying to wield soft power in Eastern Europe and get half of their government funding from the sales of oil, are suffering because of their policies and because of that. And it's because of American producers, and not just the men and women that are in Texas, that are in Pennsylvania or Ohio and some of these shale areas, but it's because of the pipelines that unfortunately under this administration have been stymied. It's because of in Ottawa, Illinois, the silica sand that's there to help for fracking. It's all this stuff that has come together. And if you ever wonder if we're a God-blessed country, Look at the fact that 10 years ago, we thought we would always be reliant on the Middle East for the most important resource we have, and today we see that we are once again the world leader in energy. I mean, that's exciting to me. You know, if you look at the fact that, you look at the economies of Europe right now, and you look at the fact that they would celebrate a 1% growth, and that there's this discussion of stagnation all over the world, and you see China and their economic difficulties. We have our own economic difficulties here. But you look at today's jobs report, I think it's 211,000 new jobs, down to 5% unemployment. We should be doing way better. But the fact is, we're not doing too terrible. And it's not because, frankly, I don't think it's because of the President of the United States. I don't think it's because of Congress. I think it's because of the American people and what's been built in our spirit and who we are from the very beginning, from the foundation of our country, is just we don't give up. We don't accept second best. You know, why is it that there are many, many people here at a lunch when you could be at work or somewhere else talking about your government? Because you care. You don't find this in other countries in the world. You don't find people as civically engaged as we are. Because there's something unique about the American spirit that says we're going to care about what our government's doing because it's government for, of, and by the people, and we're part of that. And you know what? The other thing is we're not going to accept failure. And so if we have a down quarter or we have a bad economy, people get upset. They throw out their politicians. They demand better. They don't retreat to their homes and say, all I care about is just taking care of my home. They care about their country. And that's unique and that's amazing. And I think that's something that we ought to celebrate. You know, when ISIS tears apart the Middle East and cuts off heads and acts brutally in the name of no God in the world that would ever accept that, by the way. When ISIS acts that way, the world doesn't look to China. The world doesn't look to Russia. They don't look anywhere but to the United States of America to come fix it. That's something, by the way, that we ought not shy away from. That's something we ought not be embarrassed of. That's something I hear so many people say, well, why do people always look to the United States of America to fix their problems? I say it's great that the world looks to the United States of America because they recognize the role that we have to play in this world. And it's a role that maybe sometimes has been flawed in execution, but we believe in human freedom. We believe in the advance of liberty. And we believe everybody anywhere in the world should be able to have a life that we have in the United States of America. I was in Liberia, and really, really challenged environment, to say it quite simply. And I was in Iraq 10 months ago. It was pretty quick after ISIS had made some of their big forays into Iraq. And I remember, you know, and I'll specifically say in Iraq, I'm in this refugee camp, and it's just sad, right? And, you know, it was built 2 weeks ago. Barely any running water, barely any place to use the bathroom, definitely no place to take a shower, and just a filthy camp. But you know, this humanity is just forced from their homes. And I'm walking, and I remember a girl comes up to me, and so initially when I get there, you know, there's this convoy and stuff, and so people are kind of intrigued. Why is there a convoy of people here? And then I get out, and word starts to spread that I'm a member of the United States of America's Congress. And it's not because of me, it's not because of I'm awesome or powerful or anything like that, but because of what I represent to these people, that they started to just come in and collapse in on me, and they just wanted to touch my suit or to shake my hand or anything. And you know, one guy's screaming at me that just give us the guns, we'll go take our house back. You guys can do this, I know you can do it. And you know, it starts to get where security is getting a little nervous for me, and this little girl wheels up her brother, and he's like 10 years old, and he has cerebral palsy. And he looks like a concentration camp victim is the best way I can describe it, just skin and bones. And she wheels him up to me, and through a translator I get her story. And she says that, you know, ISIS came into her house and killed her parents, and she watched it happen just 2 weeks ago. And she grabbed her brother, threw him in a stroller, grabbed one or two other siblings, ran outside and joined the mass of humanity fleet. You know, you hear that story, and she looks at me, even at 13, 14 years old, however she was, looks at me as the potential of being able to save her situation. You look at Liberia, and I go there, and again, it's a miserable place, honestly, great people though, and they look at us and ask us questions of how we can achieve what we've achieved here. You know, when Ronald Reagan talked about a shining city on a hill, he wasn't talking about anything except what America was built to be. Kid that graduates from high school or a kid that graduates from college should be able to raise a family and make a good salary and be able to buy a house and be able to live the American dream without oppressive 20% interest rates, which they had at the time, without having to worry about standing in line or driving into a line to fill up your car. And he also was talking about this idea of people around the world that at that time lived behind the Iron Curtain of communism. But today, I mean, we have iron curtains of dictatorial regimes. We have iron curtains of poverty, iron curtains of suppression against women and minorities. We have iron curtains of terrorism and jihadism. Ronald Reagan was talking about people that live behind the Iron Curtain being able to look to the United States of America and being inspired by how we do things. So I say all that to tell you, we've got challenges, and I'm going to briefly touch on them as I said, but you live in the best country in the world, bar none, and I want you never to forget and never walk out of a meeting with a politician letting he or she tell you how terrible everything is and walk out with your head down. Refuse to allow that to happen, because I'm tired of people that stand in front of the American people and tell them it really sucks, because actually it's pretty doggone good here in this country. And that doesn't mean we don't have challenges that we shouldn't face. We have hyper-partisanship in Washington, D.C. Look, there are probably Democrats in this room and there are Republicans in this room. And I guarantee you we could sit down over a beer and have a great conversation about our differences. But at the end of the day, when all is said and done, the difference isn't motivation. The difference is just a belief in how to get there. So we all want full employment for the American people. We all want kids that graduate from high school or college to have an opportunity to come out of poverty and to be successful. We all want a strong United States of America. We all want a strong national defense. The difference is we just see how to get to that end point differently. And that's why our founding fathers, in their infinite wisdom, built a House and Senate and a presidency and said, hey guys, go to Washington, D.C., leave your family farms, debate this stuff out, compromise, take votes, and come back and fix things. And so for a long time, in the last 2 years especially, actually, frankly, since I've been in Congress, there's been an intense hyper-partisanship that has existed. That's why we weren't able to get a highway bill done. There's not many people in Congress that would say there shouldn't be a federal role for building highways. But for some reason, we were all locked in our corners. But something happened, frankly, I think about a month or two ago, that kind of unlocked some of that extreme partisanship. Number one, I think the American people, and I think, frankly, legislators, were just getting tired of not accomplishing anything. I think we were just getting tired of coming back and saying we're not achieving anything, but we're doing our best job to fight. And the other thing was the election of Speaker Paul Ryan. Look, I like John Boehner. I think John Boehner is a great man, but there had become a very toxic environment in our party in Washington, D.C. And when you're the governing party, you have to be able to pass legislation. We had 40 members of our caucus that called themselves the Freedom Caucus that were unable or unwilling to vote for anything that had to do with a yes vote, basically. It's much easier to vote in D.C. No on everything than it is to vote yes. But what happened is Speaker Ryan came in, and he communicated to people a positive vision, communicated to our caucus a positive vision, communicated what it meant to be a Republican and what the Constitution means, what it means to work together, what it means to compromise. And if you look at the last few weeks, we just got a reauthorization of No Child Left Behind done, which has not been reauthorized, which, by the way, devolves so much power from the federal government back to the states for local control of education, more than has been done in 30 years. That takes schools out of an environment where they can't even pass a single federal test and puts more realistic standards on them and gives them the flexibility to teach their kids how they need to teach their kids. We got it done in a huge bipartisan way 2 weeks ago. And then this week, yesterday I think, we voted to pass the highway bill. Large bipartisan majorities. 5-year fully funded highway, rail, everything program that we need. Now, we have a lot of work to do. We have to have an honest conversation with you and tell you that there is not enough money coming into the Highway Trust Fund to build our roads and bridges. And in my mind, infrastructure is so very important for the future of this country, because $1 invested today means that's $3 we don't have to invest later that our kids are going to have to pay for. So we have to have a realistic discussion. The gas tax was set at basically 15 cents in 1994, hasn't been increased since. Not by any kind of inflation, anything like that. But yet the cost of labor over 20 years has increased, as naturally happens. The cost of goods and the cost of raw materials has increased. And by the way, our cars are way more fuel efficient than they've ever been. The car I drove here in gets 40 miles a gallon. In 1994, if you were getting 20, you were pretty excited about that. So the amount of money going into the Highway Trust Fund has declined very rapidly. And what happens is we find ways to pay for this, but it actually really just adds to the federal debt and deficit. As a conservative Republican, I think the most conservative way to build things for the federal government is to charge people that use it, a user fee. And so we have to find ways to fund our highways that's going to make sense, and we have to do that into the future. Things like Ex-Im Bank, which I know is a very, if you're not in manufacturing, you may not even be aware of it. But for some reason, our far right in our party made Ex-Im Bank a hill to die on, and it was just so that they could have a victory. But it had a real impact for manufacturers in my district and in Illinois, and it was going to cost real jobs. It was unilateral disarmament from the world. China has 3 Ex-Im banks, and what this does is helps to secure credit lines to export to other countries, just very simply. And there's insurance programs and everything else that comes with it. These are things that we need to work together to ensure we're not unilaterally disarming, and we got that done this week too. So we've got a lot of great things going for this country, but there's a lot more we need to do. You guys know I'm a Republican. I obviously hope a Republican wins the presidential election. Regardless, the next president of the United States is going to have to take a really strong look, not just at federal spending, and not just at the fact that we're burying ourselves in debt and deficit, but what's the good news? When I got elected, the deficit was $1.5 trillion. Today, it's about $450 billion. It's the fastest decline of the federal deficit in American history, but still entirely unacceptable. In 10 years, we'll be spending $1 trillion a year on interest on our debt. Now, what can you do with, today it was like, this year it was $250 billion. Could you imagine if we'd have invested that in getting rid of sequester on our military, or in schools in the inner city, or in roads and bridges, what we could have done? That's why spending discipline is so important, is because we're robbing the next generation of opportunities that we selfishly take for ourselves. But we have to have a president that's going to look in and say, we've got to remove some of the onerous, burdensome regulation that exists and chokes out business from hiring new people, or requires you to hire new people simply to comply with federal regulation, not to expand your workforce, not to expand anything else. And so look, a lot of challenges, a lot of successes. I'm excited actually to be in Congress at this time of the year, or at this time now. The first 4 years was not overly fun, to be honest with you. But I think we're finally hitting a point where, as the American people, we can hang on to our partisan beliefs, we can hang on to our principles, but we can also come together at the end of the day and do what's right for our country. Because men and women, this is not about us anymore. I mean, literally it isn't. The decisions we're making today are not going to impact you and I really all that much, but they are going to impact our kids and grandkids. And sadly, we live in a time where most people think that their kids or grandkids are going to be raised in a country with less opportunity than they had. And that's the first time ever in our history. But we don't need to have that anymore. We can do this because we're the American people, and we've overcome a million things in the past. One of the other things that David mentioned I should talk about just briefly is foreign policy, because I know it's on a lot of people's minds. I was one of the first men. I'm not saying this is a bragger. I hate when politicians talk about all that they've done, but I'm talking about what I've done a little bit here. I was actually, I think, the first member of Congress to call for bombing ISIS. And this was when we thought they were still Al-Qaeda. They had moved into Fallujah. And at the time, there had been about maybe 1,500 to 2,000 of them. Today, we know there's 30,000. We know they're well-traveled, well-trained, and we know they've established a caliphate the size of Indiana. And this caliphate now has a governance structure in it. So when people mistakenly compare how you fight an insurgent group like Al-Qaeda to how you fight ISIS, that's incorrect. Because ISIS, for all intents and purposes, is now a state that controls territory that actually has a governing structure and courts and schools and everything else. But they're not doing courts with the idea that you get represented if you're guilty. It's under Sharia law. And they're not doing schools with the idea that we ought to educate women and give them opportunities. They're doing schools in the idea that only men deserve the right to learn about anything that has to do with education, and it should be all under the construct of Sharia. This is a very dangerous cancer, and this cancer is spreading across the Middle East, and it's like a fire, it's like a volcano right now. It started in Syria, but as the volcano spews out ash and lava, it's catching fire elsewhere. We saw it move into Iraq. We see it now in Lebanon. We see Israel is threatened on its border to some extent. We see it, frankly, possibly threatening Jordan. We see it in Tunisia. We see it in the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. We see it in the streets of Paris, and I believe we saw it in California about 2 days ago. We saw radical jihadist Islamic terror that doesn't hate us because we somehow are friends with Israel. They don't hate us because, frankly, we invaded Iraq. The Arab Spring did not get started in Iraq. It got started in northern Africa. They hate us because we believe in freedom and because a man and a woman sitting at a table next to each other have the same rights in here as anybody. That's why they hate us. And they will not relent until they destroy our way of life. I'm not trying to be overly dramatic. I'm telling you the truth. If you don't believe me, look at the terrorist attacks all over the place. The only reason Paris didn't happen in Washington, D.C. or Chicago is because they couldn't get here. But you see what happens in California. Somewhere along the spectrum, between no use of military and World War II use of military, lies the amount of force necessary to defeat this cancer. I say we employ that amount of military and defeat ISIS once and for all. And you know what? Maybe a second iteration comes up in 5 or 10 years. We'll do the same to them again. Your United States military... Your military is not a bunch of puppy dogs that need hugged and coddled and pet and played with. Your military is the fiercest, best equipped, best trained killing machine that has ever existed in the history of the earth. And that is something we ought to be proud of. I know it's heartless to say. It's heartless to say, but it's a reality. And I think until America wakes up and says, we have people that want to kill us, and we either fight them there or we fight them here, until we wake up and do that, we're going to continue to see attacks like what happened in California, Paris, and elsewhere. A lot of big challenges on the foreign policy front, but I got a lot of faith in us, in the future, and in the American people. So with that, look, it's an honor to be here. I'd love to just open up the floor for questions and thoughts, because I know probably a lot of you have a lot on your mind. I'm losing my voice, I think. It's fun. Yes?
Congressman, I guess I'll throw the monkey out in the room. If Donald Trump becomes the Republican nominee, will you support him?
Yes.
Thank you.
No, I would. Look, I would put a lot of money on he's not going to be the Republican nominee, and I'll go into the details of why. So he's leading in the polls right now, but if you actually get deeper into the polls, while he has 35% support, the other 65% of Republicans basically in these polls say they will never vote for him. And so what you'll see is, I think, as people start dropping out, and they need to start dropping out soon. I'm a Bush guy, by the way, so except Bush. No, but I think as people start dropping out, they will consolidate behind the not Trump candidate, whether that's Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, or if Jeb catches fire again. I think you'll start to see them consolidate behind it. I'm going to tell you my issues with Donald Trump, because I'm pretty honest. I don't think he understands foreign policy. To say you're going to cede the Middle East to Russia is one of the most naive statements I've heard ever, to be honest with you. He gets a lot of attention on, quote unquote, saying what people have wanted to say. Deporting 15 million people that are here illegally within 2 years is a lie. You can't do it. He knows it, but he's telling you he can anyway. I was in Texas, in border Texas. I was there with the military. We were actually doing border patrol missions. I believe we have to secure the border, secure it now. But you have 15 million people that aren't here legally. Many of them have established a life here. The idea that you could go to a place like Harlingen, Texas, which is 100% Hispanic. I was the only not Hispanic person there, and it's about 50,000 people. The idea that you can march into that town and deport everybody that's not there legally is impossible. You guys remember the Elian Gonzalez thing? Remember the uproar when they just simply deported one kid? Imagine now 15 million people. And the only way to actually follow through at deporting in Harlingen, Texas, is to surround the city with the National Guard and not let anybody in or out, and scan everybody's retinas and find out who's legal and who's not, and then put them on a paddy wagon and drive them 10 miles south. Is that what we are as a country, honestly? No. And to stand up in front of people and say you're going to do that, as a Republican, offends me, because not just is it dishonest, and I'm sick of politicians that are dishonest, by the way, Not only is it dishonest, it's playing on the darkest fears of people and stirring the dark part of people's soul instead of the optimistic part of people's soul, like Ronald Reagan did when he ran for president. Hispanics are not the problem in this country. I believe we need strong border control. I believe that I'm not for an automatic pathway to citizenship, but I also say that if you're getting free stuff from the government, like those that are here illegally, you ought to put them on the rolls, make them legal, and make them pay taxes. That's what they want to do. Allow them to get work where it's necessary. So these are mature conversations we need to have, and unfortunately I think Donald Trump has taken what should be a very, very serious deliberative process of picking a president of the United States, and he's turned it into a very base emotional entertainment show. And personally, I don't like it. And no offense to anybody that supports Trump in here. I really don't mean to do that. But I'm unfortunately a straight shooter sometimes. Most of the time. Yeah.
You touched on a little bit with the California shootings, but where do you kind of stand with the recent mass shootings? Because there are way too many.
Yeah.
I think it's becoming too commonplace.
There are. I think it's incorrect to assume that it's the prevalence of guns that leads to mass shootings. I think it's the prevalence of evil hearts. I think there's a focus, too, on the media. The reality that anytime there's a mass shooting, any kid that's disaffected in his parents' basement that decides he could now be famous, and this is the only way to do it, decides that he's going to pick up a gun and walk in and indiscriminately shoot people. I think we have to have a new focus on mental health in this country. Right now, it is impossible if somebody has mental health problems and you see them as a real danger to society to get them help without their consent. In many cases, they don't consent. I think we have to have a real new focus on mental health. I think that's an area that unfortunately for 20 years has fallen aside by the wayside. And I think just by definition, if you're willing to walk in and indiscriminately shoot people, you have a real mental health problem. I also don't have any problems with ensuring that the background checks in this country are complete. People that shouldn't own guns should not own guns. And I think that's an area where we can have real bipartisan consensus. But we do have a Second Amendment in this country, and I think it's incorrect, and as some have tried to do, to focus on California, for instance, as an issue of guns. You can't buy a pipe bomb, which they had, I think, 15 to 20 of them. You can't buy them at any sporting goods store here.
Can I push it a little bit further?
Yeah.
Sorry. A lot of people, New York Daily News came out with a great cover for their paper after California. And
I actually thought it was pretty offensive.
You thought it was pretty offensive?
Yeah, if it's the one that said, your God doesn't care anymore or something like that.
It didn't. I think the point that they were trying
Oh,
to
I get the
make-
point, but I was just offended.
Sure. No, and that's taken with offense. But a lot of people talk, and not do. Is there any sort of action going on in Congress to kind of combat that mental health,
Yes.
that?
Yeah, the mental health side of things, yeah. Dr. Murphy has a bill that we're hoping to advance. We're in negotiations with the Democrats right now, and we're hoping to advance that pretty soon. And that's been our response to addressing this issue, to identifying people with mental health problems and helping to move forward on that. Again, though, there's when it comes to the issue of gun control, I think we can have realistic measures. I mean, nobody's against that. Well, there's some, but I think the vast majority of people are for realistic measures. But the idea that any kind of existence of a gun is the thing that leads to mass shootings, I think, is incorrect. Yeah. And I get your point. Thank you. Yeah.
Congressman, can you just talk briefly about the tax extensions
Yeah.
before Congress?
So many of you guys probably deal with these expiring provisions that have expired and are coming back and everything else. Our goal is to make these permanent. Let me be honest with you, I don't think it's going to happen necessarily. So what we're looking at probably is a 2-year extension of the tax extenders right now. This is the update I got yesterday. I'm not deeply involved in the negotiations. So probably a 2-year extension of the package. And then the hope is under the next president that we have a real discussion about tax reform in this country. The last time we had a real tax reform package was 1985. It's something you need to do every 15 to 20 years. I think you protect some of the big write-offs like home mortgage interest and charitable giving, and then you take a look at other areas, but make sure that that is compensated by bringing the overall rate down and making the tax system far less burdensome for the American people. And for corporates, for companies that pay corporate tax rates, I mean, you're paying 16% more in corporate tax than many of your overseas competitors, and then we wonder why some of our products aren't competitive, or we wonder why companies move overseas.
We have time for one.
One more. Yeah, I guess I answered everything, didn't I?
About the government funding bill, one of the
Oh, yeah.
we took last year was keep the lights on. Some of the candidates, not Jay,
well, if we can do everything we want, we should just shut down the government. What do you say about that?
I'm so tired of people talking about shutting down the government. Like we tried that under the Obamacare issue. You guys remember government shut down for 18 days. If you're a Republican, this will concern you because the day after we reopened the government, we did polling, and the Republican image among voters was worse than it was after the Watergate scandal because they saw us as unwilling to be leaders. Now, we ended up winning more seats. Some people incorrectly attribute that to shutting down the government. Ted Cruz, for instance, which I think is ludicrous to say. The reality is it's because Obamacare was rolled out so terribly. And by the way, that's a whole nother thing we could talk about. The day of reckoning of Obamacare is coming, and this is something we have to be very aware of. I'm on Obamacare as a member of Congress. You guys probably didn't know that, but we generously wrote ourselves into Obamacare, so now we are part of it. I say generously. It was before I got here. Anyway, so yeah, in terms of where we're at on the funding bill, we're going to pass an omnibus bill that is basically the proper way to do funding, which is, good thing instead of a continuing resolution. And we'll either do that this coming week or the next week. And the government runs out of funding by December 11th. If we don't have anything negotiated, we'll probably just extend that for a week and then pass a funding bill. So don't worry, I think you'll have a Merry Christmas, and you won't have to worry about the government being shut down. Now, Illinois is very different, by the way. I just want to say one brief thing about Illinois. Just one brief thing. I am just blown away that somebody that's been in politics longer than I have been alive dares say that the problem with Illinois lies with a guy that's been governor for 10 months. That's all I have to say. Thank you, guys.